The clock on my nightstand read mi borne, the numbers glowing like radioactive embers in the pitch-black silence of my bedroom. At 63, you'd think I'd be used to the quiet, but after 35 years as a major crimes inspector in the heart of the city, silence still feels like a predator waiting to strike. I've spent more than half my life responding to the worst moments of other people's lives, and I've learned one universal truth. Nothing good ever happens after midnight, and a phone call at 3 in the morning is never a social invitation. When the vibration rattled the mahogany wood of my side table, my heart didn't just skip. It hammered against my ribs with the force of a battering ram. I reached for the phone, my joints stiff from decades of chasing suspects down rain-slicked alleys. I didn't even look at the caller ID before pressing it to my ear. "Grandpa?" The voice was thin, trembling, and saturated with a terror so raw it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was Caleb, my 17-year-old grandson, my only reason for drawing breath since my daughter Julianne passed away 5 years ago. "Caleb? Slow down, kid. I'm right here." "Talk to me," I said, my voice dropping into that low, authoritative rumble I use to keep rookies from losing their cool at active crime scenes. I was already sitting up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed, my mind instantly categorizing the threat levels. "I'm at the 7th precinct, Grandpa." They locked me up. Sterling called the police. He told them I attacked him, but I didn't, I swear. He came at me first, and a sob broke through his words, a jagged sound that tore through my chest. "The sergeant here, he's friends with Sterling. He won't even listen to me. He says I'm going to juvie." "Please, Grandpa, you have to come." "Caleb, listen to me very carefully," I said, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. "Don't say another word. Not to the sergeant, not to the guy in the next cell, not to the walls. You tell them your grandfather is on his way, and that you are invoking your right to counsel. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," he whispered. "I'm coming for you, son. Hang tight." I hung up and moved with a speed I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need to turn on the lights. I knew this house by heart, every creak and every shadow. I pulled on a pair of dark slacks and a tactical jacket I'd kept from my days on the force. In the bottom drawer of my dresser, tucked beneath a stack of old flannel shirts, sat a small leather case. Inside was my retired inspector's badge. It didn't carry any legal weight anymore. I was just a private citizen now, but in this city, a gold shield from the Major Crimes Unit still had enough ghost power to open a few doors. As I fumbled for my car keys, the name Sterling Blackwood echoed in my head like a curse. Sterling was the man my daughter-in-law, Helena, had married barely a year after we buried my Julianne. He was a venture capitalist, a man who smelled of expensive cologne and cheap ethics, always name-dropping the mayor and bragging about his contributions to the Police Athletic League. I'd seen his type 1,000 times in interrogation rooms, men who used their wealth like a gilded cage to trap everyone around them. I never liked the way he looked at Caleb, like the boy was a messy stain on his pristine, expensive life. I backed my SUV out of the driveway of my quiet suburban home in Ironwood Heights and tore through the empty streets. The city at night is a different beast, a landscape of neon and shadow that I used to own. Now I felt like a ghost haunting my own territory. The 7th precinct was a grim, brutalist block of concrete in the North End. I'd spent 10 years of my early career there. The smell of stale coffee and industrial-strength floor cleaner hit me the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors. It was the scent of my youth, and tonight it smelled like a trap. The desk officer was a kid, maybe 24, with a buzz cut and a look of practiced indifference. He didn't even look up from his computer. "Help you?" "I'm Elias Thorne," I said, leaning over the high counter. I didn't shout. Shouting is for people who aren't in control. "I'm here for my grandson, Caleb Thorne." He was brought in on a domestic assault charge. The kid tapped a few keys, his expression never changing. "Thorne, yeah, he's being processed. Stepfather is the complainant. Sterling Blackwood. You can't see the kid until the sergeant clears it." "Then get Sergeant Vane out here," I said, my eyes narrowing. I remembered Jax Vane. He'd been a beat cop when I was a lieutenant. He was the kind of officer who always seemed to find the most expensive watch at a crime scene and forget to log it into evidence. "Tell him Elias Thorne is waiting, and tell him I'm not in a patient mood." The officer looked up then, seeing something in my eyes that made him reach for the intercom. A few minutes later, the heavy door to the back buzzed open. Jax Vane stepped out, his uniform shirt straining against a belly that had seen too many steak dinners on someone else's tab. He had a thick, silver-flecked mustache and eyes that darted around like a cornered rat's. "Elias," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Long time. I heard you were out in the heights, playing golf and enjoying the quiet. What brings you to this hole in the wall?" "Cut the crap, Jax," I said, stepping closer until I was well within his personal space. "My grandson is in a cell. I want him out. Now." Vane's grin faltered. "It's not that simple. The complainant is a high-profile guy. Sterling Blackwood. He's got some nasty bruises. Elias. A split lip, a possible broken nose. He says the kid went berserk. Caleb doesn't have a violent bone in his body," I countered. "He's a straight-A student who spends his weekends at the library. If he hit Sterling, it was because he was being pushed." "Not according to the evidence," Vane said, his voice dropping into a tone that was far too rehearsed. "We've got video, Elias. Sterling's got a state-of-the-art security system in that mansion of his. The camera in the library caught the whole thing. I want to see it." Vane hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine. Follow me. But it's not going to make you feel any better." He led me back to his cramped, cluttered office. On his desk was a framed photo of a group of men on a private yacht. I spotted Vane in the back, holding a beer, and right in the center, looking like the king of the world, was Sterling Blackwood. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. This wasn't just a friend helping a friend. This was a paid-for service. Vane turned his monitor toward me and hit play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. It was the study a room filled with leather-bound books and mahogany. Sterling was standing near the desk, gesturing wildly. Caleb appeared in the frame, looking small and defensive. Suddenly, without any clear provocation on the audio-less tape, Caleb lunged forward, shoving Sterling with both hands. Sterling fell back, his face slamming into the edge of a heavy marble bust. Blood sprayed instantly. The video cut to black. "That's it?" I asked, my heart sinking. "That's all we need," Vane said, leaning back in his creaky chair. "Assault on a family member. Considering the severity of the injury, we're looking at a felony charge. The DA is already interested. High-profile victim, troubled teen. It's a slam dunk, Elias." "Troubled teen?" I slammed my hand on the desk, making the coffee in Vane's mug ripple. "The kid has never even had a detention." "Who gave you that line? Sterling?" "I have school reports, Elias. Instances of verbal aggression," Vane lied, his eyes not meeting mine. "I want to see my grandson. Now." As his acting representative, I'm demanding 5 minutes. Vane sighed, the sound of a man who knew he'd eventually have to give in to the old lion. 5 minutes. "But don't try anything, Elias. This isn't the old days. Everything is recorded." He led me down to the holding area. The smell here was worse sweat, despair, and the sharp tang of urine. Caleb was sitting on a metal bench in the far corner of a 3-man cell. When he looked up, the sight of him nearly broke my resolve. His left eye was swollen shut, a deep purple hematoma blooming across his cheekbone. There was a jagged cut above his eyebrow that was still oozing blood, and his lip was puffed to twice its normal size. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice cracking. Vane unlocked the door and let me in, staying by the bars, his arms crossed. I pulled Caleb into a hug, feeling the boy trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "I'm here, Caleb. I'm here," I murmured. I pulled back and gently tilted his face toward the dim overhead light. "Who did this to you? Was it Sterling?" Caleb glanced nervously at Vane, then looked down at his shoes. "Hey," he said. I tripped. "He said if I told anyone what really happened, he'd make sure Mom lost everything. He said he'd have her committed." "Tell me what happened, Caleb. The truth." "He came home in a rage," Caleb whispered, his voice so low I had to lean in. "He said he'd lost a big contract because someone leaked his private emails. He accused me of hacking his computer. I didn't do it, Grandpa. I don't even know his password. But he wouldn't listen. He dragged me into the library and started swinging. He hit me, and I just tried to get away. I pushed him so I could run to my room, and he tripped over his own feet and hit the statue. Then he called the police and told them I attacked him in cold blood." "Where was Helena?" "She's in Chicago for that conference," Caleb said, a tear tracing a path through the dried blood on his cheek. "She doesn't even know. Sterling said he'd call her and tell her I'd been arrested for drugs if I didn't shut up." I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a setup. Sterling had used his influence to turn a victim into a criminal, and he'd used a corrupt cop to polish the lie. I turned and walked out of the cell, my eyes locked on Vane. "My grandson has a concussion and 6 visible injuries that weren't in your report, Jax." "Why isn't there a medical examiner's report in the file?" He resisted arrest, Vane said smoothly. The officers had to use force to subdue him. Resisted? He's Matrum born muy pounds soaking wet. You sent 2 300-pound bruisers to pick him up. That's not force. That's a beatdown. I leaned in, my voice a deadly whisper. I want a doctor here, now. And I want the full, unedited security footage from that house. Not the 30-second clip you showed me. You're out of line, Thorne, Vane snapped, his face reddening. You're a civilian. You want to play lawyer. Go past the bar. Otherwise, get out of my precinct before I find a cell for you too. I walked back out to the waiting area, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't fight Vane on his turf, not yet. I needed an ally. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't touched in 3 years. Miller, a sharp, feminine voice answered on the second ring. Detective Miller, it's Elias Thorne. There was a pause. Sarah Miller had been my protégée, the smartest detective I'd ever trained. She was now a lead in the Internal Affairs Division, a position that made her the most hated and most feared person in the department. Inspector? It's 3:30 in the morning. Is everything okay? No, Sarah, it's not. I'm at the 7th. They've got my grandson on a trumped-up assault charge, and Jax Vane is holding the leash. I need a favor. A big one. Tell me, she said, her voice instantly shifting into professional mode. I need you to look into the metadata of a video file uploaded to the 7th server in the last 2 hours. And Sarah, I need you to do it off the record. If Vane sees Internal Affairs sniffing around, he'll delete the original. I'm on it, she said. But Elias, if Sterling Blackwood is involved, you're poking a hornet's nest. He doesn't just own cops. He owns half the city council. Then I guess it's a good thing I've never liked the city council, I said, hanging up. I sat on the hard plastic chair in the lobby, watching the clock. Every minute Caleb spent in that cell was a minute Sterling was winning. I looked toward the entrance just as the heavy glass doors swung open. Sterling Blackwood walked in. He was wearing a $1,000 silk robe under a trench coat, his face perfectly composed except for a small bandage on his nose. He looked like a grieving father, the perfect image of a victim. But when his eyes met mine, the mask slipped for a fraction of a second. There was no grief there. Only a cold, predatory triumph. He walked straight toward me, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Elias, he said, his voice smooth as oil. I didn't expect you to be up so late. It's a tragedy, isn't it? About the boy. I tried to help him, I really did. But some bloodlines are just tainted. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I know what you did, Sterling, and I know why you did it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the desk officer couldn't hear. It doesn't matter what you know, old man. It matters what I can prove. And right now, I've got the video, the police, and your daughter-in-law's loyalty. By the time I'm done, Caleb won't just be in juvie. He'll be a memory. He leaned in even further, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. I didn't just edit that video, Elias. I erased the only person who could have saved him. And if you keep digging, I'll make sure Helena is the next one to have an accident on the stairs. What happened next changed everything. Because as Sterling turned to walk toward Vane's office, my phone vibrated. A text from Sarah Miller. Elias. The video wasn't just edited. It was filmed 3 days ago. The timestamp was forged. Where is Caleb's mother? My heart stopped. If the video was 3 days old, then Sterling hadn't been attacked tonight, which meant the blood on his face wasn't from a struggle with Caleb. I looked at the door to the holding cells, then back at Sterling's retreating back. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just fighting for Caleb's freedom anymore. I was fighting to find out whose blood was actually on that marble statue. The text from Sarah Miller felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. A forged timestamp meant this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment domestic dispute. It was a cold, calculated operation. Sterling hadn't just reacted to a push tonight. He had directed a movie 3 days ago and waited for the perfect moment to premiere it. My mind raced, cataloging every interaction I'd had with Sterling Blackwood over the last 2 years. I realized then that I'd been looking at him through the eyes of a grieving father-in-law, not a seasoned investigator. That was my first mistake, and in my line of work, the first mistake is often the only one you're allowed. I looked across the precinct lobby at Sterling. He was leaning against the sergeant's desk, laughing at something Jax Vane said. He looked so comfortable, so untouchable. That was the Blackwood way. They were old money in a city that worshipped at the altar of prestige. They owned the heights, the banks, and, as I was quickly learning, the people sworn to protect them. I remembered the first time Helena brought him to Sunday dinner. It was 6 months after the first anniversary of my son Daniel's death. Daniel had been a firefighter, a man who lived and died for others. Sterling was his polar opposite, refined, soft-handed, and smelling of leather and expensive cigars. At the time, Helena looked like a woman who was finally surfacing for air after drowning in grief. She was my daughter-in-law, but I loved her like my own. When she told me Sterling had proposed, I saw the light back in her eyes and kept my reservations to myself. Caleb, however, had been different. Even at 15, the boy had an internal compass that never pointed anywhere but north. "He's a fake, Grandpa," Caleb had told me one night while we were working on my old truck. "He talks to Mom like she's a prize he won at an auction, not a person." I dismissed it as teenage resentment, a son protecting his father's memory. I didn't know it then, but Caleb was the only one of us who was actually seeing clearly. "Vane," I called out, my voice cutting through their laughter like a serrated blade. Sterling's head snapped toward me, the smugness faltering for a heartbeat before resetting into that polished mask. I walked over, my eyes fixed on the man who had replaced my son. "I need to speak with Helena, right now." Sterling adjusted his trench coat, his movements deliberate and graceful. "I told you, Elias. She's in Chicago at the Harrison-Kensington Gala. It's a closed-door event. She has her phone off for the keynote speakers. You know how she is about her charity work. She'll call when she lands tomorrow morning. Is that right?" I stepped into his space, ignoring Vane's hand on my shoulder. "Because there's a problem with your timeline, Sterling. And in my experience, when the timeline breaks, the whole story falls apart." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sterling said, though I noticed the slight twitch in his jaw. "The police have the evidence. Caleb needs help, Elias. Professional help. I'm willing to drop the charges if you agree to have him admitted to the Blackwood Institute. It's a private facility, very discreet. It's what's best for the family." The Blackwood Institute. I knew the place. It was a high-walled fortress in the countryside, officially a psychiatric hospital, but unofficially a warehouse for the wealthy to hide their problematic relatives. If Caleb went in there, he'd be drugged into silence and hidden from the world until Sterling had finished whatever he was planning. "The only place Caleb is going is home with me," I said. I turned to Vane. "Jax, I want to see the intake logs for the injuries Sterling claimed. And I want the badge numbers of the officers who responded to the active assault call tonight." Vane stepped between us, his face hardening. "You're done here, Thorne." "I've been patient because of your history, but you're harassing a victim in my lobby. Go home. Get a lawyer. Let the system work." "The system is working exactly the way Sterling paid it to work," I spat. I walked out of the precinct, the cool night air hitting my face. I didn't go to my car. Instead, I walked around the corner and pulled out my phone. I needed to know where Helena really was. If the video was 3 days old, then the assault was a ghost. And if Sterling was willing to forge evidence to disappear Caleb, what had he done to Helena? I called Sarah Miller back. "Sarah, I need a location on Helena Thorne's cell phone, and I need a tail on Sterling's black sedan." "He's leaving the precinct now." "Elias, I'm already on it." Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker. She sounded worried. I pinged Helena's phone. "It's not in Chicago. It's at the Blackwood estate in the Highlands. It hasn't moved in 48 hours. A cold dread settled in my gut. Check the flight manifest for the Chicago trip. See if she ever boarded. Already did. She checked in, but she never went through security. Her ticket was never scanned. Elias, something is very wrong. I'm also seeing some weird financial movement. In the last 3 days, someone has been liquidating the Thorne family trust, Daniel's life insurance, the house equity. It's all being funneled into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The money Daniel left for Caleb's education," I whispered. Sterling wasn't just trying to get rid of the boy. He was robbing him blind. He was stripping the Thorne legacy down to the bone before he discarded us. I jumped into my SUV and headed toward the Highlands. It was the Old Money District, a collection of sprawling estates hidden behind iron gates and 10-foot stone walls. The Blackwood Manor sat at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oaks that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. I parked a block away and moved through the woods, my old training taking over. My knees ached and my breath was short, but the adrenaline kept the pain at bay. I reached the perimeter of the estate. The house was a massive Tudor-style mansion, mostly dark, except for a few lights in the upper windows. I moved toward the library, the room from the video. The heavy curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light escaped from the bottom. I crouched low, peering through the gap. The room was a mess. It didn't look like the site of a teenage outburst. It looked like a struggle. A heavy floor lamp was overturned, and the marble bust Sterling had mentioned was cracked on the floor. But it was the dark stain on the Persian rug that caught my eye. It was large, too large for a split lip or a bloody nose. I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from Sarah. Elias, get out of there. I just ran the plate on the car that picked Sterling up from the precinct. It's registered to a holding company owned by Jax Vane's brother. And I found something else. 3 days ago, a private medical service was called to the Blackwood estate. An emergency sedative was administered to a female patient. No names on the report, but the doctor who signed off on it is on Sterling's payroll. I looked back at the house. Sterling had told me Helena was in Chicago. Caleb thought she was in Chicago. But she was here, drugged and hidden, while Sterling drained her accounts and framed her son. Suddenly, the floodlights on the back patio flared to life, bathing the lawn in a blinding white glare. I ducked behind a stone planter, my heart thumping against my ribs. I know you're out there, Elias, a voice boomed over the estate's PA system. It was Sterling. He sounded amused. You always were a better cop than a grandfather, but you're trespassing on private property. And in this neighborhood, the security guards are authorized to use lethal force. I heard the low, guttural growl of a dog, a Doberman, if I had to guess, and the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. I had to move. I wasn't armed with anything but my wits and a retired badge, and Sterling had the home field advantage. I slipped back into the shadows of the oaks, moving toward the rear of the property where the old servant's entrance was. I remembered Helena mentioning that the keypad code was Caleb's birthday. A rare moment of sentimentality from Sterling. I reached the door and punched in the numbers. Kung Salmot High. The lock clicked open. The air inside the house was cold and smelled faintly of lavender and something chemical like a hospital. I moved silently through the kitchen and into the main hall. I needed to find Helena. If I could get her out, if she could testify to what Sterling was doing, the whole house of cards would come down. I climbed the back stairs, my hand hovering over the pistol at the small of my back. Every floorboard that creaked sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the mansion. I reached the second-floor landing and saw a light under the door of the master suite. I pushed the door open an inch. Helena was there, lying on the massive 4-poster bed. She looked pale, her breathing shallow and labored. An IV drip was set up next to the bed, clear liquid snaking into her arm. She wasn't in Chicago. She was a prisoner in her own home. I rushed to her side, tapping her cheek gently. Helena? It's Elias. Wake up, honey. Her eyes fluttered, but they were glassy, unfocused. Daniel? She murmured, her voice a ghost of itself. Is it time for the game? No, Helena. It's Elias. We have to go. Sterling is... I stopped. The sound of a gun cocking behind me made the blood in my veins turn to ice. I told you, Elias, Sterling said from the doorway. He was holding a sleek, silver semi-automatic, and he looked entirely too comfortable with it. Some bloodlines are just tainted. Daniel was a fool who ran into burning buildings, and you're a fool who walks into traps. He stepped into the room, his eyes flicking to the IV. She's not going anywhere. The Blackwood protocol is very thorough. By tomorrow morning, she'll have suffered a psychotic break brought on by the stress of her son's arrest. She'll be deemed unfit to manage her affairs, and I, as her devoted husband, will take over the Thorne estate to protect it. You're a dead man, Sterling, I said, my voice low and steady. I have a detective from Internal Affairs looking at your accounts. I have the metadata from your fake video. You can't kill us all. Sterling laughed, a dry, hollow sound. I don't have to kill you, Elias. I just have to make you disappear. Jax Vane is already writing the report. Grieving grandfather, unable to cope with his grandson's crime, breaks into the family home and attacks his daughter-in-law in a fit of rage. It's a tragedy, a double tragedy. He leveled the gun at my chest. But before we finish this, I want you to know something. I didn't just want the money. I wanted to erase Daniel. I wanted to take everything he loved and turn it into something ugly. And looking at you now, I think I've succeeded. What Sterling didn't know was that I had started a recording on my phone the moment I entered the room. Every word of his confession was being beamed directly to Sarah Miller's private server. But Sterling wasn't done playing. Do you know what really happened in the library 3 days ago, Elias? Caleb didn't push me. He found the papers. He found the transfer orders for the trust. He tried to call you, but I took his phone. He fought back. He actually landed a punch. Sterling touched the bandage on his nose. I had to teach him a lesson. I hit him until he stopped moving. Then I realized I could use it. "You monster," I whispered. "Monster? No. I'm a businessman." He took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And tonight, I'm closing the books on the Thorne family." Suddenly, the sound of a window shattering downstairs echoed through the house. Sterling flinched, his eyes darting toward the door. "What was that?" he hissed. "That," I said, a grim smile spreading across my face, "is the sound of the tainted bloodline coming for you." I didn't know it yet, but Caleb hadn't stayed at the precinct. He'd escaped, and he wasn't coming for a hug. He was coming for blood. The distraction was all I needed. As Sterling's eyes flicked toward the hallway, I didn't reach for my gun, I reached for him. I lunged low, putting every ounce of my 63 years into a shoulder tackle that caught him right in the diaphragm. We slammed into the mahogany wardrobe, the air huffing out of his lungs in a sharp, wet gasp. The silver semi-automatic skittered across the polished floor, disappearing under the heavy lace dust ruffle of the bed where Helena lay oblivious. Sterling was younger and faster, but I had the kind of old man strength that comes from decades of hauling heavy equipment and wrestling suspects who didn't want to go to jail. I pinned him against the wood, my forearm pressed against his throat. "The thing about businessmen, Sterling," I hissed, my face inches from his, "is that they never expect a fair fight. But I've spent my life in the mud. I like the mud." He clawed at my eyes, his manicured nails digging into my skin. But then a heavy thud echoed from the staircase. Boots. Multiple pairs. Sterling's panic transformed into a jagged, ugly grin even as he struggled to breathe. "You think, that's Caleb?" he wheezed, a trickle of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth where I'd clipped him. "That's not the boy, Elias. That's Jax. I told you, I own the 7th. The bedroom door burst open. It wasn't my grandson. It was Sergeant Jax Vane and 2 uniformed officers I didn't recognize. They didn't have their tasers out. They had their service weapons drawn and leveled at my head. "Step away from him, Elias. Now," Vane bellowed. His face was a mask of professional fury, but I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. He knew he was crossing a line he could never uncross. I slowly raised my hands, stepping back from Sterling. Sterling slumped to the floor, clutching his throat and coughing, but his eyes were fixed on Vane with a look of frantic command. "He tried to kill me, Jax," Sterling screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He broke in. He attacked Helena. Look at her, he drugged her." It was the perfect lie. A veteran cop, unhinged by grief, attacking his family. In the eyes of the law, at this moment, I was the villain and Sterling was the survivor. "Handcuff him," Vane ordered the 2 officers. As the cold steel ratcheted around my wrists, I looked Vane dead in the eye. "You're throwing away 20 years for a man who would sell your soul for a tax break, Jax. Is the payout really that big?" Vane didn't answer. He turned to the other officers. "Take him out the back way. No sirens. We're taking him to the holding facility at the Blackwood Institute. We'll process him there, away from the media circus." The Blackwood Institute, the private warehouse. If they got me there, I would never see a courtroom. I'd be another unfortunate case of a broken man who couldn't be saved. They hauled me down the stairs. My mind was screaming for a way out, searching for Caleb. If he had broken that window, where was he? As we passed the library, I saw the shattered glass on the floor, but no sign of the boy. I felt a flicker of hope. If Caleb was still free, there was still a chance. They tossed me into the back of an unmarked black sedan. Vane sat in the front passenger seat, while the 2 officers, who I realize now weren't wearing badges, sat in the front and beside me. These weren't cops. They were Sterling's private security dressed in surplus uniforms. This wasn't an arrest. It was a kidnapping. The car tore down the winding driveway, leaving the estate behind. I looked out the tinted window, watching the skeletal trees blur past. My phone was in my pocket, still recording, still streaming to Sarah Miller. But how long until they realized? How long until they swept me for devices? "Give me the phone, Elias," Vane said, not looking back. "I know you're old school, but you're not stupid. I know you're wired." I didn't move. The man beside me reached into my pocket, his movements rough and clinical. He pulled out the device and handed it to Vane. Vane looked at the screen, his face paling as he saw the active upload icon. "He's streaming," Vane hissed. He smashed the phone against the dashboard, then threw the remnants out the window. "Doesn't matter. By the time Internal Affairs gets a warrant for this car, you'll be voluntarily signed into the Institute, and your testimony will be worth as much as a used napkin." We drove in silence for 20 minutes, heading deep into the wooded outskirts of the city. The Blackwood Institute appeared like a Gothic nightmare, a Victorian mansion converted into a fortress, surrounded by an electrified fence and topped with coils of razor wire. The gates hummed open, and we pulled into the courtyard. 2 orderlies in white scrubs were waiting. They didn't look like medical professionals. They looked like bouncers. They pulled me from the car, their grip like iron. "Welcome to your retirement, Elias," Vane said, stepping out of the car. He looked around the bleak courtyard, his expression momentarily dark. "It didn't have to be like this. You could have just let the boy go to juvie for a few months. But you had to be the hero. You always had to be the hero. And you always had to be a coward, Jax," I replied. They dragged me through the heavy oak doors. The interior was a jarring contrast to the exterior, sterile, white, and smelling of ozone and bleach. They led me down a long corridor, where the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. We stopped in front of a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced glass slit. The orderly turned a key and pushed me inside. The room was small, padded, and empty. "Wait," I said as the door began to swing shut. "Where is the boy? What did you do with Caleb?" Vane stood in the doorway, a shadow against the white light of the hall. "The boy? He's the reason you're here, Elias. Sterling told us he saw him at the estate. My guys are hunting him right now. And trust me, Sterling gave them orders to make sure he doesn't make it to a precinct." The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my soul. Click. The lock engaged. I was alone. In the silence, the weight of my failure pressed down on me. Helena was drugged. Caleb was being hunted like an animal, and I was buried alive in a private prison. I sat on the floor, my back against the padded wall, closing my eyes. I reached into my memory, back to the training, back to the thousands of hours I'd spent observing human behavior. Sterling was a narcissist. Vane was a mercenary. Narcissists always leave a trail of their own greatness, and mercenaries always have a price. I waited. 1 hour. 2. My shoulder throbbed where the old injury had been flared up by the struggle. I needed a tool. I needed a way to flip the script. Then, I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the ventilation duct near the ceiling. It wasn't the sound of rats. It was rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. My heart leaped. It was a code Daniel and I had used when he was a kid playing hide-and-seek. A firefighter's knock. "Caleb?" I whispered, looking up at the grate. "Grandpa," a voice hissed back, muffled by the metal. "I'm in the crawlspace." I followed the car. "Caleb, you have to get out of here. You have to go to Sarah Miller. She's the only one." "No." Caleb's voice was hard, cold in a way I'd never heard before. "I found something, Grandpa. When I broke into the library, I didn't just find the trust papers. I found Sterling's black ledger. It was hidden behind the bust. It's got everything. Every bribe, every payoff, every name, including Vane's. Caleb, listen to me. If they find you with that ledger, they won't arrest you. They'll kill you. They have to catch me first," he said. "I'm going to the security room. I saw the layout on a map in the hallway. I'm going to open your door, and then we're getting Mom." "Caleb." "Wait." But he was gone. The scratching moved away. I stood up, my adrenaline surging. The troubled teen Sterling had tried to frame was gone. In his place was a Thorn who had inherited his father's bravery and his grandfather's tactical mind. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The silence was agonizing. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway outside my cell flickered and died. An alarm began to blare, a low, pulsing red light strobing through the glass slit in the door. Clack. The lock on my cell door disengaged. I pushed the door open. The hallway was a chaos of red shadows. At the far end, I saw a slim figure in a dark hoodie. Caleb. He was holding a heavy ring of keys and a tablet he'd liberated from the security desk. "We have to move," he said, grabbing my arm. "Vane and his guys are in the basement looking for me. I triggered the fire suppression system. It's going to lock down the lower levels." "Where's the ledger?" I asked. He patted the front of his hoodie. "Safe." "But Grandpa, there's something else." I looked at the security feed before I cut the power. Sterling isn't at the estate anymore. He's coming here. And he's not alone. He's bringing a specialist to handle Helena. A specialist. That meant the IV drip wasn't just a sedative anymore. It was a terminal dose. "We're not leaving without your mother," I said. "And we're not leaving until I finish what I started with Jax Vane." We moved through the darkened halls of the Institute. But as we reached the main lobby, the front doors burst open. Sterling Blackwood stepped in, bathed in the red strobe of the emergency lights. He wasn't wearing a trench coat anymore. He was wearing a tactical vest, and he was carrying a high-powered rifle. I didn't think the kid had it in him, Sterling shouted over the alarm, his voice echoing with a terrifying mania. But this ends tonight. I'm tired of playing games with ghosts, Elias. He raised the rifle, aiming straight for the shadow where Caleb was standing. I didn't know it yet, but the next 10 seconds would decide the fate of the Thorne family forever. The roar of the alarm was a physical weight, a pulsing red heartbeat that made the lobby of the Blackwood Institute feel like the throat of a dying beast. Sterling stood silhouetted against the open doorway, the rain lashing at his back, his rifle leveled at the darkness where Caleb stood. The man I had once thought was merely a greedy social climber had fully shed his skin. He looked feral, a predator who realized the cage door had been left open and was determined to kill everything in sight before he was caught. "Move, Caleb!" I screamed, lunging toward my grandson. The rifle barked a sharp, deafening crack that shattered the glass of a nearby trophy case. Shards of crystal rained down like diamonds in the strobe light. Caleb rolled behind a heavy marble reception desk, the black ledger clutched to his chest like a shield. "I see you, boy," Sterling yelled, his voice cracking with a high, wheezing laugh. "You think you're smart? You think you're your father? Daniel died for nothing, and you're going to die for a book nobody will ever read." I stayed low, moving through the shadows of the peripheral columns. My service weapon was gone, my phone was destroyed, and my hands were still bound in front of me by the heavy steel zip ties Vane's men had used. I was a 63-year-old man with a bad shoulder and no gun, facing a madman with a semi-automatic rifle. But I had one thing Sterling didn't: 35 years of knowing exactly how a man moves when he's scared. And Sterling was terrified. He was losing his empire, and he was losing his mind. "Sterling," I shouted, my voice echoing from a different corner of the room to draw his fire. "Look at me. You want the Thorne legacy? I'm the last of it. Leave the boy out of this." He spun toward my voice, the barrel of the rifle searching the red-lit gloom. "You're a relic, Elias. A ghost in a badge. You're already dead. You just haven't stopped breathing yet." From the corner of my eye, I saw Caleb peeking over the edge of the desk. He wasn't looking at Sterling. He was looking at the fire suppression panel on the wall behind the desk. He caught my gaze and gave a tiny, sharp nod. The kid was thinking 3 steps ahead. "Grandpa, the nitrogen," Caleb mouthed. I understood instantly. This was a high-security medical facility. The fire suppression in the lobby wasn't water, it was a gas-based system designed to choke out fire by displacing oxygen. If Caleb triggered the manual override, the room would fill with a fog that would blind Sterling, but it would also make it impossible for us to breathe for more than a minute. "Do it," I roared. Caleb slammed his fist into the emergency lever. A hissing sound, like 1,000 angry snakes, erupted from the ceiling vents. Thick, white chemical fog billowed downward, turning the red strobe-lit room into an opaque soup. Sterling screamed, firing blindly into the mist. Crack, crack, crack. The muzzle flashes were orange bursts in the white fog, but he was shooting at shadows. I used the noise to sprint. I didn't head for the door, I headed for Sterling. I hit him at full tilt, using my bound hands like a club. I swung my arms upward, catching him under the chin with the heavy plastic and steel of the zip tees. His head snapped back, and the rifle discharged into the ceiling. We went down together, sliding across the slick tile floor. I scrambled for the weapon, but Sterling was younger, and fueled by a manic strength. He kicked me in the ribs, a blow that sent stars dancing across my vision, and scrambled backward into the fog. You're suffocating us. You old fool." Sterling coughed, his voice muffled by the gas. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were being filled with wet sand. I crawled toward where I thought Caleb was, my hand sweeping the floor. I found the strap of a backpack. "Caleb," I wheezed. "I'm here," he gasped, grabbing my arm. He pulled a small, disposable oxygen mask from his bag, something he must have grabbed from the security office. He pressed it to my face. "Breathe, Grandpa. We have to go. Now." We stumbled toward the rear of the lobby, back into the patient wing where the air was still clear. I looked back through the glass doors. Sterling was stumbling in the fog, clutching his throat, his rifle forgotten on the floor. But he wasn't the only threat. From the basement stairs, I heard the heavy thud of boots. Jax Vane and his 2 officers emerged, gasping for air, their faces red and sweaty. Vane saw us through the dissipating fog and drew his sidearm. "Thorne, stop!" Vane yelled, but he was coughing too hard to aim. "Go, Caleb, get to your mother." I shoved him toward the stairs leading to the private suites. "I'll hold them here." "Not without you." "That wasn't a request, Caleb. Secure the ledger and get Helena. I'll be right behind you. I watched him disappear up the stairs. Then I turned to face Vane. I retreated into the darkened cafeteria, a vast room filled with heavy industrial tables and stainless steel counters. It was a maze of cold metal perfect for a game of cat and mouse. Vane and his men entered the room slowly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Elias, give it up. Vane's voice echoed, sounding hollow and tired. Sterling is losing it, but I can still get you out of this. Just give me the ledger. We'll say the kid stole it. We'll put him in a juvenile facility, and you can go back to your quiet life. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Is that what you told Daniel? I called out, my voice bouncing off the metal walls. The flashlight stopped. What? The night of the fire. 5 years ago, I said, my heart cold. Daniel was the lead on that warehouse fire downtown, the one owned by the Harrison-Kensington Group, Sterling's partners. The report said it was a backdraft, an accident. But Daniel told me the day before that he'd found evidence of arson. He said he was going to the DA. There was a long silence. The only sound was the hum of the industrial refrigerators. Daniel was too honest for this city, Elias, Vane finally said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. He didn't know when to look away. He was going to cost very powerful people a lot of money. So you killed him, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. You didn't just let him die. You ensured it. You were the commanding officer on the scene. You called the all clear when he was still inside. He was a hero, Elias, Vane said, and I could hear the click of his safety being turned off. Everyone got a medal, even you. Now, give me the ledger, or you can join him in the dirt. I felt a cold, crystalline fury settle over me. This wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It wasn't even about the money. This was about a 5-year-old blood debt. I moved silently behind a row of stainless steel prep tables. I found what I was looking for, a heavy industrial meat cleaver magnetized to a wall rack. I grabbed it, the cold steel feeling right in my hands. I couldn't swing it properly with the zip tees, but I could use the weight of it. I waited until one of the officers passed my position. I lunged out, swinging the heavy cleaver in a downward arc. The flat of the blade caught the man across the temple with a sickening thud. He collapsed without a sound. I grabbed his fallen flashlight and his tactical knife. One down, Jax, I shouted, clicking the flashlight on and off to confuse them. Spread out, Vane barked. He's just an old man. Kill him. I slipped into the walk-in freezer, the heavy insulated door clicking shut behind me. It was sub-zero inside, the air thick with frost. I knew Vane would think I was trapped. I knew he'd come in, thinking he had the advantage. Sure enough, a minute later, the door creaked open. A beam of light cut through the hanging sides of beef. I know you're in here, Elias, Vane whispered. You're freezing your bones for a boy who's already dead. Sterling is upstairs with Helena right now. Do you really think Caleb can stop him? I didn't answer. I was crouched behind a pallet of frozen crates. As Vane passed, I threw the tactical knife. I wasn't aiming for him, I was aiming for the emergency release lever on the inside of the door. The knife hit the mechanism, jamming the lock from the inside. Vane spun around, realizing too late. He fired 2 shots into the darkness, the bullets thudding into the frozen meat. You're locked in here with me, Jax, I said, stepping out from behind the crates. And in 30 minutes, your heart is going to slow down to nothing. But I've spent my life in the cold. I don't mind the wait. Vane lunged at me, his face contorted with rage. We crashed into a rack of frozen poultry, the metal shelving groaning under our weight. He dropped his gun, and we began to roll on the ice-slicked floor. He was stronger, but I was fighting for my son's memory. I jammed my bound wrists against his throat, using the zip ties to choke him. Whose blood was on the statue, Jax? I wheezed, my lungs burning from the cold. Vane clawed at my face, his eyes bulging. It wasn't Caleb. Who was it? The house manager? Vane gasped. He saw Sterling stealing the trust papers. Sterling killed him and made Caleb watch. Then he framed the boy. My blood ran cold. Sterling hadn't just framed Caleb. He'd traumatized him with a murder and then tried to convince him he was the monster. I let go of Vane's throat just enough for him to breathe, but kept him pinned. Where is the body? In the basement of the manor, Vane choked out. Under the new wine cellar floor. Suddenly, my radio, the one I'd taken off the first officer, crackled to life. It was Caleb's voice, but he sounded terrified. Grandpa, he's here. He's got Mom. He's on the roof. He has a helicopter coming. Grandpa, Help! I looked at Vane, then at the jammed door. I didn't have 30 minutes. You're going to stay here and freeze, Jax, I said, grabbing his fallen handgun. I used the butt of the weapon to smash the zip tees against a metal corner until the plastic snapped. And when the real police get here, they're going to find a cold, lonely man with a lot of secrets. I kicked the emergency release, the knife falling away, and sprinted out of the freezer. I didn't look back. I ran through the kitchen, up the back stairs, my legs screaming, my heart feeling like it was going to burst through my ribs. I reached the roof access door and kicked it open. The wind was howling, the rain turning into a torrential downpour. At the far edge of the roof, standing near the helipad, was Sterling. He had one arm wrapped around Helena's neck, his other hand holding a pistol to her temple. She was semi-conscious, her head lolling. Caleb was 10 feet away, kneeling on the wet gravel, the black ledger lying in the mud between them. "Pick it up, boy," Sterling screamed over the wind. "Pick it up and throw it over the edge, or I pull the trigger." "Don't do it, Caleb," I shouted, stepping onto the roof. Sterling spun his gaze to me, the muzzle of the gun never leaving Helena's head. "Elias, you're like a cockroach. You just won't die." "It's over, Sterling," Vane talked. "We know about the house manager. We know about the wine cellar." Sterling's face went pale, his eyes darting toward the sky where the faint thrum of a helicopter was getting louder. "It doesn't matter. I'm leaving this city. I have the accounts. I have the money, and I'm taking my wife with me." "She's not your wife," I said, taking a slow step forward. "She's the woman you robbed, the woman whose husband you murdered." The helicopter appeared over the tree line, its searchlight sweeping across the roof, blinding us. Sterling squinted against the light, his grip on Helena loosening for a fraction of a second as he signaled the pilot. It was the only opening we'd get. Caleb didn't throw the ledger. He lunged forward, grabbing Sterling's legs. Sterling roared, looking down to kick the boy away. "Now, Helena!" I yelled. Helena, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, bit Sterling's arm with everything she had. He shrieked, the gun firing into the air as she broke free and collapsed toward me. Sterling recovered, pointing the gun at Caleb's head. "You little brat, I'll kill you first." I didn't think. I didn't aim. I just fired Vane's gun. The bullet caught Sterling in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled backward, his heels catching on the low perimeter wall of the roof. He flailed for a moment, his eyes wide with a sudden, crushing realization of his own mortality. He didn't scream as he fell. He just vanished into the dark, the wind swallowing him whole. I ran to Caleb, pulling him into my arms, while Helena crawled toward us, sobbing. We huddled together on that freezing roof, the searchlight of the helicopter, which I realized now was a police chopper, not Sterling's, bathing us in a harsh, cold light. "Is it over, Grandpa?" Caleb whispered into my chest. I looked at the black ledger lying in the mud, and then at the staircase where Sarah Miller was emerging with a tactical team. "No, Caleb," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of the last 5 years. "The secrets are out. Now, the real war begins." What happened next changed the history of this city. Because Sterling Blackwood didn't die that night, and he wasn't the biggest monster in the ledger. The cold on that roof didn't just seep into my bones. It felt like it was trying to freeze my very soul. I stood at the edge, the wind whipping my hair against my face, looking down into the dark abyss where Sterling Blackwood had vanished. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible, ringing silence, followed by the distant crunch of metal and plastic. He hadn't hit the pavement. He'd crashed through the glass canopy of a secondary ventilation housing 3 stories down. I saw his body sprawled there, a broken marionette in a tuxedo, illuminated by the rhythmic red flash of the hospital's emergency lights. He wasn't moving, but he was breathing. I could see the faint steam of his breath against the cold glass. The monster was broken, but he wasn't gone. Sarah Miller's team swarmed the roof like a colony of hyper-efficient ants. They moved with a clinical precision that made the chaos of the last hour feel like a fever dream. I felt a heavy wool blanket draped over my shoulders, and a pair of firm hands, Sarah's hands, guided me away from the ledge. I didn't look at her. My eyes were locked on Caleb and Helena. They were huddled together near the rooftop exit, being checked over by paramedics. Caleb was still clutching that leather-bound ledger to his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Elias, look at me," Sarah said, her voice sharp enough to pierce through the adrenaline-induced fog in my brain. "We have them. We have Vane in custody, and Blackwood is being prepped for emergency surgery. It's over." I looked at her then, my eyes narrow and stinging from the rain. "It's not over, Sarah. A man like Sterling doesn't build an empire like this alone. He had help. He had the 7th precinct in his pocket, and God knows who else. We'll find them, she promised. But right now, I need you to give me that ledger. It's evidence, Elias. It needs to be processed. I looked over at Caleb. He saw us talking and stood up, his legs shaking but his gaze fixed. He walked over and handed the book not to Sarah, but to me. I looked at the last page. Grandpa, he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. In the security room, before I cut the power, I saw the names. I took the book. The leather was cold and slick with rain. I didn't open it, not yet. I knew that once I saw what was inside, there would be no going back to my quiet life in Ironwood Heights. I'd be stepping back into a war that had already claimed my son. We were escorted out of the Blackwood Institute under a heavy guard. Sarah didn't take us to a precinct. She knew, as I did, that the blue wall was currently a minefield. She took us to a dark site, a nondescript safe house in the Kensington district, a neighborhood of high-walled brownstones and silent streets, where money bought the kind of privacy the law couldn't provide. Helena was taken to a private room where a doctor began the slow process of flushing the sedatives from her system. Caleb refused to leave my side. He sat on a velvet armchair in the safe house's study, looking small and fragile in the oversized tactical jacket someone had thrown over him. I thought I was going crazy, Grandpa, Caleb said, staring at his hands. When Sterling hit me in the library that night, he kept whispering that I was the one who killed Mr. Harrison. He kept saying he was protecting me, that the police would execute me if he didn't hide the body. I started to believe him. I started to think maybe I had blacked out. The psychological cruelty of it made my stomach churn. Sterling hadn't just framed Caleb, he had tried to colonize the boy's mind. He's a liar, Caleb, I said, kneeling in front of him. He killed that man because he was a witness to the theft of your father's legacy. He used your grief as a weapon against you. Sarah entered the room, her expression grim. She had a laptop open, connected to a secure server. Elias, I've started cross-referencing the digital files you streamed before your phone was destroyed. The metadata from the assault video is a match for the forgery Caleb described. But the ledger. We need to talk about the ledger. I walked over to the desk and opened the book. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten entries. It wasn't just a list of bribes. It was a roadmap of the city's rot. There were dates, amounts, and initials. J.V. Jacks Vane, M.R. Judge Montgomery Ross, C.K. Commissioner Harrison Kensington. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the name Kensington. He wasn't just the commissioner. He was the man who had given the eulogy at my son Daniel's funeral. He had stood at the pulpit, weeping, calling Daniel a shining light of the department. Kensington, I whispered, the name feeling like ash in my mouth. He was in on it. The warehouse fire, Daniel's death. It was all for a real estate payout? It's worse than that, Sarah said, tapping a key on her laptop. I just got a ping from the hospital. Sterling Blackwood is out of surgery, but he didn't go to the recovery ward. 2 men in suits, claiming to be federal marshals, picked him up 20 minutes ago. They had papers signed by Judge Ross. They took him, Elias. He's gone. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The system wasn't just broken. It was actively protecting itself. Sterling wasn't just a businessman. He was a key piece on a much larger board, and the people he'd bought weren't about to let him talk to internal phrase. They're going to kill him, I said. They aren't rescuing him. They're cleaning up the mess. We have to get Helena and Caleb out of here, I said, turning to the door. This safe house. Sarah, who authorized this location? Sarah froze. Her eyes widened as she looked at her phone. The deputy commissioner, Harrison Kensington's right-hand man. We're in a trap, I barked. Get your team ready. We're leaving through the basement. But as we moved toward the hallway, the sound of tires screeching on the pavement outside echoed through the house. Through the security monitors on the wall, I saw 3 black SUVs scream to a halt in front of the brownstone. Men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by balaclavas, poured out of the vehicles. They weren't wearing police insignia. They were the specialists Sterling had mentioned. They're not here to arrest us, Caleb said, his voice trembling as he looked at the screen. No, I replied, grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. They're here to make sure the ledger never makes it to a courtroom. I ran to Helena's room, lifting her from the bed. She was groggy, her eyes unfocused, but she gripped my arm. Elias, where's Daniel? Is he coming? Not tonight, honey, but I'm here. I led them down the narrow servants' staircase to the basement. Sarah was right behind us, her service weapon drawn. We could hear the sound of the front door being breached, the explosive thud of a battering ram, followed by the shattering of wood and glass. The basement was a labyrinth of old stone foundations and copper pipes. It led to a small coal chute that opened into the alleyway behind the house. I pushed Caleb through first, then helped Helena. I followed, my bad shoulder screaming in protest as I hauled myself out into the cold night air. We didn't go for Sarah's car. They'd be watching it. Instead, we sprinted through the shadows of the alley, heading toward the subway station 2 blocks away. The city was a maze of neon and grime, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in it. Every siren I heard sounded like a death knell. Every blue uniform I saw made me want to draw my weapon. We reached the station just as a train was pulling in. We vanished into the crowd of late-night commuters, a broken family and a rogue detective hiding in plain sight. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her breath hitching. "I can't go back to IAD. I can't trust my own commander." "We're going to the only person who doesn't owe Harrison Kensington a damn thing," I said. "Who?" "The man who lost everything when Sterling Blackwood moved into the Highlands." 2 hours later, we were standing in a dilapidated apartment in the shadows of the old shipyard. The man who opened the door was Silas Vane, Jax Vane's older brother. He was a disgraced former detective who had spent the last decade in a bottle after he tried to blow the whistle on the Kensington Syndicate. He looked at us, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He looked at me, then at Sarah's badge. "I told you, Elias. 10 years ago, I told you this city was built on a graveyard. You didn't want to hear it then." "I'm hearing it now, Silas," I said, stepping into the cramped, smoke-filled room. "And I have the book to prove you were right." D. I laid the black ledger on his coffee table. Silas stared at it as if it were a live grenade. He reached out, his hand shaking, and turned to the middle section. "What happened next changed everything," Silas murmured, his eyes scanning the pages. "You think this is just about money? Look at the dates, Elias. Look at the names of the properties." I leaned in. The properties weren't just warehouses. They were the sites of every major fire in the city over the last decade. And the insurance payouts were all funneled into a company called Aegis Holdings. "Aegis," Sarah whispered. "That's the primary contractor for the new City Hall project." "It's not just a contractor," Silas said, looking up at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "Aegis Holdings is owned by the mayor's wife. And the chairman of the board? That's your son's old captain. The betrayal went all the way to the top. Daniel hadn't been killed by a rogue sergeant or a greedy businessman. He had been executed by the very infrastructure of the city he gave his life for." I looked at Caleb, who was sitting on a crate in the corner, his eyes wide with a realization that no 17-year-old should ever have to bear. I looked at Helena, who was finally starting to understand that her perfect second husband had been the architect of her first husband's death. "We can't win this in a courtroom," Silas said, closing the book. "They own the judges. They own the marshals. They'll wait until you run out of places to hide, and then they'll bury you beside Daniel." "I'm not running anymore," I said, a cold, hard clarity settling over me. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Harrison Kensington was sitting in his office, thinking he had won. Somewhere, Sterling Blackwood was being hidden away, his wounds being patched so he could be sent into exile. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the empty room. But I was done being a cop. I was done being a victim. If they wanted to play by the rules of the mud, I was going to show them exactly how dirty the mud could get. I turned back to Silas. "You still have those files? The ones they fired you for?" Silas gave a slow, jagged smile. "I never throw anything away, Elias, especially not the truth." "Good," I said. "Because tomorrow, we're not going to the police. We're going to the one place Sterling Blackwood can't buy." "Where?" Caleb asked. "The public," I replied. "But first, I need to make one more call. To a man named Jax Vane." "What are you doing, Grandpa?" Caleb asked, his voice filled with a new kind of fear. "I'm going to offer the sergeant a deal," I said. "I'm going to give him the one thing the syndicate won't. A chance to live." I didn't tell them the rest of the plan. I didn't tell them that to save the Thorne family, I was going to have to burn the city to the ground. The rain outside Silas Vane's apartment didn't just fall. It drummed against the rusted fire escape like a relentless warning. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the bitter, metallic tang of old secrets. I looked at my daughter-in-law, Helena, who was sitting on a moth-eaten sofa, her face a pale mask of shock. The fog from the sedatives was lifting, but it was being replaced by a much darker reality. "He killed him, Elias," she whispered. her eyes fixed on a peeling patch of wallpaper. Sterling didn't just replace Daniel, he watched him die. I didn't have words to comfort her. My own heart felt like a block of cold marble. For 5 years, I had grieved for my son, believing his death was the tragic price of his heroism. I had shaken Harrison Kensington's hand at the funeral. I had let him pin a medal on Caleb's small chest while the cameras flashed. All that time, the man who had ordered the hit was standing right there, smelling of expensive cologne and false sympathy. "We can't just stay here," Sarah Miller said, pacing the small, cluttered room. Her hand was habitually resting on her holstered weapon, her instincts as a detective screaming at her. "Kensington knows Silas is the only one left who knows the original structure of Aegis Holdings. This is the first place they'll look once they realize the safe house was a bust." Silas Vane let out a dry, hacking laugh. He was hunched over a bank of old monitors, his fingers flying across a keyboard that looked older than Caleb. "They already know, Detective. I've been tracking the police scanners. There's an all-points bulletin out for Elias and the boy. Only they're not calling it an arrest warrant. They're calling it a protective custody order. That's syndicate speak for shoot on sight if they don't come quietly." I looked at Caleb. He was remarkably still, his eyes fixed on the black ledger. He wasn't the scared boy from the precinct anymore. Something had hardened in him, a steel core that I recognized from his father. He looked up at me, and I saw the question in his eyes. He wanted to know how we were going to make them pay. "Silas," I said, my voice low and steady. "You said Jax was in custody. Where?" "The county annex," Silas replied, not looking up. "It's a secondary facility. They use it when the main jail is too crowded or when they want someone to disappear into the paperwork. Kensington's people have a long reach there, but it's not as fortified as the 7th. I need to talk to him," I said. "Are you crazy?" Sarah snapped. "Going to a county facility right now is suicide. You're the most wanted man in the city. Jax is the only one who knows the location of Sterling's private offshore servers," I countered. "The ledger has the names and the bribes, but the servers have the digital trail, the emails, the wire transfers, the proof that the mayor's wife is the primary beneficiary. Without that, the ledger is just a book of fairy tales that any high-priced lawyer can debunk." I didn't know it yet, but the next hour would be the last time I ever acted within the shadow of the law. I was done being an inspector. I was becoming a ghost. We spent the next 30 minutes prepping. Silas provided us with burner phones and a set of forged press credentials he'd kept from a previous life. Sarah managed to secure an unmarked transport van from a contact in the motor pool, who still didn't know she was a fugitive. We left Helena with Silas. He might have been a drunk, but he was a man who knew how to stay hidden. "Keep this near you," I told Helena, handing her a small, concealed carry pistol I'd liberated from one of Sterling's guards. "If anyone comes through that door who isn't us, you don't hesitate." She nodded, her jaw set. For the first time, I saw the fire of the Thorne family back in her eyes. The drive to the county annex was an exercise in sheer terror. Every patrol car that passed made my heart hammer against my ribs. Caleb sat in the back, silent, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. He was holding a small tablet Silas had given him, his fingers hovering over the screen. "I can get into the annex's internal network, Grandpa," Caleb said suddenly. Silas showed me the back door. "I can loop the security cameras for 10 minutes. That's all you'll have." I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "You're sure?" "I have to do this, Grandpa. For Dad." We pulled into a dark alleyway behind the annex, a grim concrete box tucked between a tire fire warehouse and a freeway overpass. Sarah stayed with the van, her eyes scanning the perimeter. I took the stairs, Caleb's voice in my ear through a wireless earpiece. "Cameras looping. Now. You're clear for the service entrance." I moved with a fluid, practiced grace I hadn't felt in a decade. I breached the service door using a keycard Sarah had provided, a relic from her time in the 7th. The interior of the annex was a maze of fluorescent lights and the hum of industrial air conditioners. It smelled of floor wax and human misery. "Cell Borntrumbler High," Caleb whispered. "They moved him to isolation 10 minutes ago." "Grandpa, wait. There's movement on the floor. 2 men, not guards." I flattened myself against the wall as 2 figures in dark suits walked past the end of the corridor. They moved with the unmistakable posture of professional cleaners, men who didn't exist on any payroll, men who were sent to finish what Sterling couldn't. "They're going for Jax," I hissed. "You have 60 seconds before the loop resets," Caleb warned. I sprinted down the hall. I reached cell Borntrumbler High just as the 2 men were swiping a master key. I didn't yell. I didn't identify myself. I lunged. I caught the first man with a heavy blow to the back of the neck, his head slamming into the steel doorframe. The second man spun around, reaching for a suppressed pistol in his shoulder holster, but I was faster. I jammed my palm into his chin, snapping his head back, then followed up with a knee to the gut. They were down, but they weren't out. I grabbed the master key from the floor and swiped it. The heavy door hissed open. Jack's Vane was sitting on the edge of a cot, his face bruised and his spirit visibly broken. He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. He thought I was the one who had come to kill him. "Elias?" he gasped. "The syndicate sent cleaners, Jax," I said, gesturing to the men unconscious in the hall. "Kensington doesn't want you testifying. He doesn't want you breathing." Jax looked at the men, then back at me. He slumped, his shoulders heaving. I knew it. I knew he'd cut me loose. "Give me the server locations, Jax. Give me the passwords. Give me everything on the mayor and Kensington, and I'll get you out of here alive." "You can't get me out of here," Jax said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "They own the exits. They own the air we're breathing." "I'm not the law anymore, Jax," I said, leaning in until our foreheads almost touched. "I'm a thorn, and you know what we do to people who hurt our family. You can either die in this cell tonight, or you can help me burn them all to the ground." Jax swallowed hard. He reached into the waistband of his orange jumpsuit and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. He gave this to me for safekeeping, sterling. He didn't trust Kensington either. It's got the digital keys. The servers are in the basement of the Kensington Sterling Tower downtown, hidden behind a false wall in the private gym. "Grandpa, the loop is over. Security is coming." Caleb's voice was frantic. I grabbed the drive and turned to the door. "Stay down, Jax. If you're lucky, the real cops will get here before the next set of cleaners." I didn't wait for his answer. I sprinted back toward the service entrance, the sound of heavy boots and sirens beginning to echo through the building. I burst out into the alleyway just as Sarah was revving the engine. "Go! Go!" I shouted, diving into the sliding door. We tore away from the annex, the blue and red lights of the pursuing patrol cars reflecting in the puddles. But we didn't head back to the safe house. We headed for the heart of the beast, the Kensington Sterling Tower. What happened next changed everything. I murmured to myself as I looked at the thumb drive in my palm. We had the keys to the kingdom, but we were 3 people against a city's worth of corruption. As we approached the downtown skyline, the massive glass needle of the Kensington Sterling Tower loomed over us like a monument to arrogance. It was the tallest building in the city, a fortress of steel and ego. "Caleb, can you get us in?" I asked. "The gym is on the Bournemouth floor," Caleb said, his eyes glued to his tablet. "But the elevator requires a biometric scan, and the building's private security is the Blackwood Group. They'll be expecting us." "They won't be expecting us to come from above," Sarah said, looking at the roof. I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Silas has a contact in the Port Authority," she said. "A helicopter. A former search and rescue pilot who owes Elias his life. He's waiting at the heliport 5 blocks away." It was a crazy plan. It was the kind of move a man makes when he has nothing left to lose. We reached the heliport, and 5 minutes later, we were in the air. The city looked beautiful from above a tapestry of lights that hid the rot beneath. We hovered over the roof of the Kensington Sterling Tower. The wind was fierce, the rain turning into a sleet that lashed against the cockpit. I looked at Caleb and Sarah. "Stay with the pilot," I told Caleb. "If things go south, you take that thumb drive, and you get to the state capitol. You find the Attorney General. You don't stop for anyone." "I'm coming with you, Grandpa," Caleb said, his voice absolute. "No, you're the insurance policy." I looked at Sarah. She nodded. We checked our weapons, a pair of service pistols and the tactical knives we'd taken from the cleaners. We descended onto the roof, the helicopter's blades kicking up a whirlwind of freezing rain. We breached the roof door and descended the stairs to the Bournemouth floor. The hallway was silent, the plush carpet muffling our footsteps. We reached the private gym, a sprawling space of chrome and glass. I moved toward the back wall, my hands searching the wood paneling for the seam Silas had described. I found it. A hidden latch. The wall swung open, revealing a small, climate-controlled room filled with humming servers and flickering blue lights. "This is it," Sarah whispered. I plugged the thumb drive into the main console. The screen flared to life, a cascade of data streaming past. Aegis Holdings, Project Firefly, the Daniel Thorne Protocol. My breath hitched. The Daniel Thorne Protocol. I opened the file. It wasn't just about his death. It was a plan to use the Thorne family's reputation to legitimize the syndicate's expansion. They had planned to make Caleb the face of a new charity that would act as a front for their money laundering. They hadn't just killed my son, they were planning to steal my grandson's future. Uploading to the cloud, Sarah said, her fingers flying across the keys. In 5 minutes, every news outlet in the country will have this. Not so fast, Elias. The voice was calm, cultured, and utterly devoid of mercy. I turned to see Harrison Kensington standing in the doorway of the gym. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, but he was holding a high-caliber revolver with a practiced ease. Beside him was Sterling Blackwood, his shoulder in a heavy brace, his face pale and twisted with a mask of pure hatred. "You always were a nuisance, Elias," Kensington said, stepping into the room. Daniel was the same. Too much integrity, not enough sense. We offered him a seat at the table, you know. He could have been the youngest commissioner in history. But he chose to be a martyr. He chose to be a man. I spat. And look where it got him. Sterling snarled, his voice a ragged wheeze. A hole in the ground and a family of fugitives. Kensington raised the revolver, his eyes cold. "Give me the drive, Elias, and maybe I'll let the boy live, as a gesture of respect for your son." I looked at the screen. Tamwe Lumfan Trum uploaded. "I didn't know it yet," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "But you guys really underestimated the boy." Suddenly, every screen in the server room and every television in the gym outside flared to life. It wasn't the data. It was a live video feed. Caleb was sitting in the helicopter, his face broadcast on every monitor in the building, and, as I realized from the ticker at the bottom, on the Jumbotron in the city square 3 blocks away. "My name is Caleb Thorne," his voice echoed through the room, amplified by the gym's sound system. "And I'm going to tell you the truth about how this city really works." Kensington's face went white. He looked at the screens, then back at me. "Shut it down. Sterling, kill the connection." "It's too late, Harrison," I said, stepping forward. "The upload is complete. The city is watching. And the police units that aren't on your payroll are already in the lobby." The sound of sirens, hundreds of them, erupted from the streets below. The building's alarms began to blare. Sterling let out a roar of frustration and lunged at me, his good arm swinging a heavy metal weight bar. I ducked the blow and caught him with a punch to his injured shoulder. He shrieked, collapsing to the floor. Kensington aimed the revolver at my chest, his hand trembling with a sudden, violent rage. "I'll take you to hell with me, Thorne." He pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small room. I felt a searing heat in my side, a white-hot flash of pain that knocked me backward into the server racks. But I didn't fall. I looked up to see Sarah Miller standing over Kensington, her weapon smoking. She had fired a fraction of a second after him, her bullet catching him in the chest. Kensington slumped against the wall, the revolver falling from his hand. He looked at the blood blooming on his silk shirt with a look of utter disbelief. You ruined it," he wheezed. "Everything. We built. It was built on blood, Harrison," I said, clutching my side. "And now the foundation has rotted away." I looked at Sterling, who was crawling toward the exit, his face a mask of agony. "You're not going anywhere, Sterling. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, knowing that the Thorne name is the one that finally buried you." I collapsed against the server rack, the world starting to gray at the edges. I heard the sound of boots, real boots, and the shouting of officers who actually looked like they cared about the law. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Caleb. He had landed the helicopter and run into the building. He was crying, but he was smiling. "We did it, Grandpa," he whispered. "We got them." "Yeah, son," I gasped, the pain in my side becoming a distant thrum. "We got them." What happened next changed the history of the city, but it also changed the history of our family. But before I tell you about the final twist, I have to ask you one thing. Do you really believe that a man like Kensington was the head of the snake? Or was he just another tale? The white ceiling of the hospital room was a stark, sterile desert compared to the blood-stained carpet of the Kensington Sterling Tower. I drifted in and out of a morphine-induced haze, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator next to me keeping time with the throbbing in my side. I had a hole in my gut, a shattered shoulder, and enough exhaustion in my soul to sink a ship, but I had a smile on my face. We had won. The video was out. The ledger was public. The city was finally going to see the rot for what it was, or so I thought. 3 days later, the fog cleared enough for me to ask for a television. Sarah Miller walked in before I could reach the remote. She looked like she hadn't slept since the night on the roof. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and her shoulders were slumped in a way that made my heart drop into my shoes. "Sarah," I rasped, my voice sounding like I'd swallowed broken glass. "Where are they? Where's Caleb?" "Caleb is with Helena at a state-run safe house," she said, her voice hollow. "They're safe for now, Elias, but—" "You haven't seen the news." She picked up the remote and clicked the screen to life. I expected to see Harrison Kensington in handcuffs. I expected to see the mayor resigning in disgrace. Instead, I saw a polished news anchor standing in front of the Kensington Sterling Tower. The tragic events of Tuesday night, where a disgruntled former police inspector, Elias Thorne, suffering from a documented mental breakdown, launched a violent attack on some of the city's most prominent citizens. Commissioner Harrison Kensington remains in critical condition after the unprovoked shooting, while business mogul Sterling Blackwood continues to recover from injuries sustained during the inspector's initial break-in. Authorities state that the evidence circulated online by the fugitive was a sophisticated AI-generated fabrication, part of a delusional manifesto. I watched, frozen, as the screen showed a grainy, edited clip of me lunging at Sterling. It didn't show the gun he held. It didn't show the server room. It showed a deranged old man attacking a victim. "The Black Ledger?" I whispered. "Confiscated as fraudulent material by the governor's special task force," Sarah said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "The server room we found? It was sanitized 10 minutes after we left. The backup I uploaded to the cloud. It was scrubbed. Every major tech platform flagged it as coordinated disinformation and removed it within the hour. I felt a coldness settle over me that the hospital blankets couldn't touch. This wasn't just a city-level corruption. This was a systemic erasure. The syndicate didn't just own the cops. They owned the narrative. Kensington isn't the head of the snake, Elias," Sarah whispered, leaning in. "He's just the face. The man who signed the order to scrub the servers. The man who appointed the special task force to investigate you. It was Governor Sterling Harrison." The name hit me like a physical punch. Sterling Harrison, Sterling Blackwood's godfather. The man my son, Daniel, had supposedly been a favorite of. "They're turning the Thorne name into a curse, Elias," Sarah said, a tear finally escaping. "They're filing for emergency custody of Caleb. They're claiming Helena is mentally incompetent due to her drug addiction, the one Sterling forced on her. If they get Caleb, he'll be moved to a private facility. We'll never see him again." I hit rock bottom right there, in a sterile bed, unable to even stand on my own. I had played my best hand, risked the lives of everyone I loved, and the syndicate had simply rewritten the rules of the game while I was asleep. I was a criminal. My grandson was a ward of the state. My son's memory was being dragged through the mood. I failed him. I choked out, looking at the ceiling. I failed Daniel. I failed Caleb. "You didn't," a voice said from the doorway. I looked up to see Silas Vane. He looked sober, his eyes sharp and burning with a cold fire. He was carrying a small, nondescript laptop and a file folder that looked decades old. "They think they won because they control the digital world," Silas said, closing the door behind him. "They think if it's not on the news, it didn't happen. But they forgot one thing, Elias. They forgot about the dead files." He walked to the bed and opened the folder. Inside was a series of photographs from 25 years ago. They showed a much younger Governor Harrison, Sterling Blackwood, and my son's old captain standing around a table in a dimly lit warehouse. On the table were blueprints for the very fires that had built their empire. "Daniel didn't just find out about the warehouse fire 5 years ago," Silas said. "He found these. He realized the syndicate wasn't new. It was a multi-generational legacy. And he found the one piece of evidence that can't be scrubbed by an AI or deleted from a server." "What is it?" I asked, my heart beginning to beat with a renewed, desperate rhythm. "The physical contract," Silas said. "Aegis Holdings isn't just a company. It's a trust. And to maintain their offshore tax exemptions, they have to keep a physical copy of the founding charter in a secure, non-digital vault. It's the paper trail. It has the wet ink signatures of the governor, the mayor, and every partner in the syndicate." "Where is it?" "It's not in a bank," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "And it's not in a tower. It's in the one place they think is too sacred to touch. It's in the vault of the Daniel Thorne Memorial Library, the building they named after your son to honor his sacrifice." The irony was sickening. They had hidden their darkest secret inside a monument to the man they had murdered. "Elias, you can't stay here," Sarah said, her eyes darting to the door. "The protective custody order for you just got upgraded. They're moving you to a secure military hospital in an hour. Once you go through those doors, you're never coming out." I looked at the IV in my arm. I looked at the monitor. I was weak, I was wounded, and I was being hunted by the most powerful men in the state. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't an inspector trying to follow the rules. I was a grandfather with nothing left to lose. "Get me out of this bed," I said. The next 48 hours were a blur of pain and preparation. Sarah and Silas smuggled me out of the hospital in a laundry cart, bypassing the guards who were already arriving to escort me to my disappearance. We moved to an abandoned fire station on the outskirts of the city, a place that smelled of soot and old memories. I spent those 2 days training my body to ignore the hole in my side. I didn't need to be fast anymore, I just needed to be steady. Caleb and Helena were brought to the station. When Caleb saw me, he didn't cry. He just walked over and handed me a tactical vest. "I know what we have to do, Grandpa," he said. "The library. It's where they're holding the Legacy Gala tonight." The final insult. The governor was going to stand in a building named after my son, a building that housed the proof of his murder, and use Daniel's name to solidify his political future. "This is the reversal, Elias," Silas said, checking the magazine of his rifle. "They think we're cornered rats. They think you're dying in a hospital bed. They're going to have their guards at the doors, but they won't be looking for us inside. They're too arrogant to think we'd walk into their own celebration." "We're not just walking in," I said, looking at the layout of the library. "We're going to give the governor exactly what he wants. We're going to give him a show." I looked at my family: Sarah, the daughter I chose; Caleb, the legacy I protected; Helena, the woman who had finally woken up. We were no longer victims of a family revenge story. We were the architects of a syndicate's collapse. The revenge plan was simple: burn the lie, save the truth. As the sun set over the city, casting long, bloody shadows across the streets, I put on the dark coat I had worn 35 years ago on my first day as a detective. I checked the weight of the pistol at my hip. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, looking at the flickering lights of the city skyline. "But tonight, the Daniel Thorne Memorial Library is going to witness the only thing more powerful than a syndicate's secret: a father's justice." What happened next would be written in the history books, but it wouldn't be the version the governor wanted. It would be the truth, signed in the blood of the men who thought they were gods. The Daniel Thorne Memorial Library stood as a monument of limestone and hypocrisy, bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 decorative lights. It was a masterpiece of old-money architecture, with soaring arches and marble columns that seemed designed to dwarf the very people it was built to serve. Tonight, the cream of the city's elite, the Sterlings, the Harrisons, and the Kensingtons, glided up the red-carpeted steps in silk and tuxedos, sipping champagne and celebrating a hero they had spent 5 years trying to erase. I stood in the shadows of an alleyway across the street, my breath hitching as a sharp spike of pain radiated from the bullet wound in my side. I was dressed in a standard catering uniform Silas had procured, a black waistcoat that hid the tactical vest and the heavy weight of my service pistol. Beside me, Caleb adjusted his own bow tie, his face unnervingly calm. He looked like his father tonight, the same steady gaze, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "You ready, son?" I whispered. "I've been ready since the night you picked up the phone, Grandpa," Caleb replied. Silas and Sarah were already inside. Silas, posing as a building inspector with a forged set of city credentials, was in the basement, neutralizing the security hub. Sarah, looking every bit the high society guest in a borrowed evening gown, was moving through the gala, keeping eyes on the governor. Our target wasn't the ballroom, though. It was the founder's room on the 3rd floor, a restricted archive where the physical heart of the syndicate was hidden. I didn't know it yet, but the syndicate had one final card to play, a trap buried deeper than even Silas had suspected. We entered through the loading dock, moving past busy kitchen staff who were too stressed to notice 2 more faces in the crowd. We took the service elevator to the 3rd floor, the air growing colder as we left the music and laughter of the gala behind. The archives were a labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling shelves, smelling of dust and ancient paper. At the very back, behind a glass-encased display of my son's charred fire helmet, was the vault. It wasn't a high-tech electronic safe. It was an old-fashioned, heavy-gauge steel door with a mechanical combination lock, the kind that couldn't be hacked from a laptop. Silas had given me the numbers, pulled from a set of legacy blueprints he'd stolen a decade ago. The heavy tumblers clicked with a finality that echoed through the silent room. I pulled the handle, the door groaning on its hinges. Inside, on a pedestal of dark oak, sat a leather-bound folio. This was the paper trail, the founding charter of Aegis Holdings. I opened it, my hands trembling. There they were, the wet ink signatures of Governor Sterling Harrison, the late mayor, and 3 Supreme Court justices. But as I flipped to the final page, my blood ran cold. Tucked into the back of the folio was a piece of yellowed notebook paper, covered in a handwriting I would know anywhere. It was Daniel's. "Grandpa, look," Caleb whispered, pointing to the date on the note. It was written the day Daniel died. "If you're reading this, Elias, it means I didn't make it out. I found the charter. I couldn't take it without alerting them, so I left a mark they could never wash off. Look at the seal." I looked at the gold wax seal of the charter. Embedded in the wax was a small, charred piece of a firefighter's badge, Daniel's badge. He hadn't just found the proof. He had branded it. He knew that one day I would come looking. He had been guiding me from the grave for 5 years. He knew, I whispered, a tear finally breaking free. He knew they were coming for him. "Don't move, Inspector." The voice was a jagged rasp, like stone grinding on bone. I spun around, shielding Caleb. Standing at the entrance of the vault was Sterling Blackwood. He wasn't the polished billionaire anymore. He was in a motorized wheelchair, his face a roadmap of scars from the glass canopy he'd fallen through. His right arm was a useless, withered thing, but his left hand held a compact submachine gun with terrifying stability. "You really are a persistent old ghost," Sterling wheezed, his eyes burning with a feverish, insane light. "You think a piece of paper is going to save you? In 10 minutes, the governor is going to announce the Thorn Transparency Act. It's a legal loophole that will retroactively immunize every member of Aegis Holdings. That charter you're holding, it becomes a historical curiosity. It becomes worthless. Not if the public sees it before he signs," I said, my hand inching toward my holster. "The public sees what we tell them to see," Sterling roared, his voice cracking. "I survived a 3-story fall, Elias. I've been through hell to protect this legacy. Do you really think I'm going to let a retired beat cop and a brat ruin it?" He raised the weapon, but he was too slow. Suddenly, the overhead sprinklers erupted, drenching the room in a cold, artificial rain. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red strobe of the fire alarm. Silas had pulled the lever. "Now, Caleb," I yelled. In the chaos and the mist, Sterling fired blindly. The bullets chewed into the wooden shelves, sending fragments of history flying into the air. I lunged low, sliding across the wet floor, and tackled the wheelchair. We went down in a heap of metal and rage. Sterling clawed at my throat, his strength born of pure desperation. "You lost everything," he choked out. "No," I hissed, pinning his good arm to the floor. "I just found it." I looked up to see Caleb. He wasn't running for the exit. He had grabbed the folio and was sprinting toward the balcony that overlooked the main ballroom. "Caleb, wait!" I shouted, but he was already gone. I left Sterling gasping on the floor and ran after my grandson. I reached the balcony just as the governor was reaching the climax of his speech. The ballroom was silent, a sea of diamonds and black ties looking up at the man they thought was their king. And so, Governor Harrison boomed, his voice echoing through the massive space. "We name this building for Daniel Thorne, a man of integrity, a man who gave his life for this city. He gave his life because you murdered him." Caleb's voice cut through the room like a lightning strike. He stood at the edge of the balcony, holding the paper trail high above his head. The giant projectors behind the governor, which were supposed to show images of Daniel's childhood, suddenly flickered. Sarah Miller, standing in the tech booth with a pistol aimed at the operator's head, had done her job. The cameras on the balcony zoomed in on the charter. The high-definition screens filled with the image of the governor's signature and the charred firefighter's badge embedded in the wax. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a city's soul catching its breath. "That is the charter of Aegis Holdings," Caleb shouted, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. "It's the contract that paid for the fires that killed my father. And there is the man who signed it." Governor Harrison looked up, his face transforming from a mask of statesmanship to one of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the screen, then at the crowd. He saw the shift. He saw the Sterlings and the Kensingtons, his own people, stepping back, their eyes wide with the realization that the ship was sinking. "It's a fake," the governor screamed, his voice cracking. "Security! Remove him!" But the security guards, the real police officers who had been standing on the periphery, didn't move. They were looking at the screen. They were looking at the charred badge of one of their own. I walked out onto the balcony and stood beside Caleb, my hand on his shoulder. I looked down at the governor, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt the weight of the grief lift. "The game is over, Sterling," I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall. You can scrub the internet, you can buy the news, but you can't unring a bell this loud. The doors of the ballroom burst open. Not the syndicate's specialists, but the state police, led by a stern-faced woman I recognized as the Attorney General. Sarah had made the call. The evidence we'd leaked 3 days ago had been scrubbed from she doesn't public eye, but it had stayed in the hands of the one woman the governor couldn't fire. As the handcuffs clicked around Governor Harrison's wrists, the room erupted into a chaos of shouting and flashing cameras. The syndicate didn't go quietly, but they went. Over the next few months, the paper trail led to over 200 indictments. The mayor, the commissioner, and the board of Aegis Holdings were stripped of their assets and their freedom. Sterling Blackwood died in a prison hospital 6 months later, his body finally giving out from the injuries he'd sustained. Jax Vane took a plea deal, providing the final testimonies needed to dismantle the corruption at the 7th Precinct in exchange for a life sentence instead of the chair. A year later, the world looked very different. I sat on a park bench in Ironwood Heights, the morning sun warming my face. Beside me, Helena was reading a book, her eyes clear and her smile genuine. She had reclaimed her life, leading a foundation dedicated to supporting the families of fallen first responders. Caleb walked across the grass toward us, wearing a suit that finally fit him. He had just finished his first year of pre-law at the university. He sat down next to me, handing me a coffee. What happened next changed everything, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. I thought revenge was about burning things down. I thought it was about blood. And what is it about, Grandpa? Caleb asked. I looked at the city skyline. The Kensington Sterling Tower was being demolished, replaced by a public park. The Thorn name wasn't a curse or a monument anymore. It was a living, breathing promise. It's about making sure the truth has a place to live, I said. It's about making sure that when the phone rings at 3 a.m, there's someone on the other end who can't be bought. We sat there in the quiet of the morning, a family that had been broken, hunted, and erased, only to find ourselves again in the fire. My son, Daniel, was still gone, but as I looked at the man Caleb was becoming, I knew that the Thorn legacy was finally in good hands. The syndicate thought they owned the city. They thought they could kill a hero and sell his memory. But they forgot the most basic rule of the department. Never underestimate an old cop with a badge in his pocket and a grandson with fire in his blood. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the peace I'd searched for half a decade. The war was over. The truth was out. And for the first time in a long time, the silence of the morning didn't feel like a predator. It felt like home.